why are we here? This province needs thousands of more startups. We also need hundreds of those to become thriving, industry-leading, growth-oriented firms. A lot of people have an opinion on how to grow a company, which is why it's so important that we have somebody like Simon Reed, who's actually spent years engaging with literally hundreds of Alberta small and medium businesses to actually figure out what enables growth. And that is the knowledge that we have inserted into this very intensive, not just very long, 7-month program called Growth Catalyst.
Us and the team at 126 and Loop, we honestly felt like we were right on, I would say, like the precipice of a big growth spurt. And we saw the growth catalyst and the programs that it offered us the chance to kind of refine what we were doing as a business and really hit the mark as far as what our growth goals and objectives were. The growth catalyst really gives you a good toolkit that you can use and utilize within your business for ongoing sustainable growth, not just one big growth spurt.
We know this program is going to put 100 companies through it. And so that means 100 companies will have a greater impact on our community than they would have otherwise. Strong leaders lead companies. We're going to take 300, 350 leaders in this program in the next 2.5 years. It's about the leaders. It's about making sure you can compete, that you can innovate, and that you can expand to new markets.
What's stopping you? Join us today. Go to growthcatalyst.ca to find out more, and I look forward to welcoming you onto the next cohort.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to the next edition in the series of the Growth and Resiliency Speaker Series. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Christian Busch, and I'm going to provide a little bit of an introduction first to the session before we turn over to Christian for this particular session. So what is the Scaling Up Expert? So Scaling Up Experts is brought to you by Mount Royal University's Growth Catalyst program. We explore the latest practices that help Canadian business leaders scale up their businesses and delve deeper into the 7 scaling strategies with subject matter experts, much like Dr. Christian Busch, who we're with today. The Growth Catalyst program in and of itself is led by Mount Royal University's Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. It's an intensive program designed to spark the creation and set the foundation for executing a growth strategy by CEOs and their senior leadership team. We're delighted to have funding from Alberta Innovate's Ecosystem Development Partnership Program, Prairie's Can Regional Innovation Ecosystem Program, the TD Ready Commitment, and the Kathy and Bruce Williams Fund. To learn more about Growth Catalyst and how you as an organization or a leader can join, visit growthcatalyst.ca. But I want to get on to today's speaker. So today's session focuses on the scaling up strategy of creativity. Creativity is one of the 7 scaling up strategies we explore in the Growth Catalyst program, and it's very much focused on uncovering exponential growth opportunities. Our special guest today is Dr. Christian Busch. Christian is the best-selling author of the Serendipity Mindset, the art and science of creating good luck. Ariana Huffington mentioned it was a wise, exciting, and life-changing book, so I'm looking forward to our lives being changed today, Christian. And Paul Pullman said that it provides an excellent practical guidance for all. For those of you that do not know Christian, or this is the first time you've come across Christian, he's an internationally known expert in the area of innovation, purpose-driven leadership, and serendipity. He's director of the CGA Global Economy Program at New York University, where he's dialing in from today, and teaches at the London School of Economics. He's co-founder of Leaders on Purpose and the Sandbox Network, and a former director of LEC's Innovation Lab. His work's been featured by Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Washington Post, the BBC, the list goes on. He's a regular speaker at conferences such as the World Economic Forum, TED Talks, and is member of WEF's Expert Forum. A fellow in the Royal Society of Arts and on the Thinkers 50 radar list of the 30 thinkers most likely to shape the future. He received his PhD from LSE, where in 2018 he won a top professional award. His new favorite title is Dad. So welcome, Dad, to the session. And I'm just going to introduce what the session is going to be about. So Christian, 2 of the 5 core skills of creative intelligence, we've actually been exploring this morning with our Growth Catalyst cohort, but 2 of those elements are to do with association, so connecting often seemingly unrelated ideas together and fragments together, and also network. Network's a huge part of this notion of creative intelligence, making these new connections to learn new ideas from others. So I know that the intention of today's session is really to get deeper into how do we become more creative individuals and pursue these moments of smart luck that you mentioned, trained our minds to make accidents meaningful and build our serendipity muscle. So I'm intrigued to learn more about serendipity and that it's this muscle that can be built. And I'm ready to get to the gym. And I know everybody else on the call is ready to get to the gym. So take us to this serendipity gym. Christian, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for the wonderful introduction and the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today. I'd like to take you on a journey of exploring how we can turn the unexpected into this smart luck, into innovation, and into serendipity. Now, before doing this, and I'm very much looking forward also to our conversation, we'll have questions. So if you have questions, please do put them into the Q&A and the chats, and I'll definitely try to answer as many as possible. And, before kicking this off, I'd love to ask you if you consider yourself to be a lucky person. I don't know if we have the function here that people can just put it in the chat, but in case we have that, then please do put it wherever you can put it. And if not, just for yourselves, do you consider yourself to be a lucky person or a rather unlucky person? And I'll come back to that question in a second. But so for now, to give you a bit of context, I grew up in Heidelberg, where I used to be that kid. I was thrown out of high school, had to repeat a year, probably held the unofficial world record of how many dustbins and trash cans you can knock over on your way to school when you're driving. And then one day I wasn't so lucky anymore and crashed into 4 parked cars, all cars completely destroyed, including my own. And I won't forget the policeman who came to the scene, and he was like, oh my God, he's still alive. And that idea that I was supposed to be dead, that stuck with me. And I asked myself all these weird questions. If I would have died, who would have come to my funeral? Who would have actually cared? Was it all worth it? And at that point, I had mostly depressing answers. And so it took me on this intense search for meaning, trying to figure out what is life all about. And chat is enabled now, by the way. So now everyone, if you want to put lucky or unlucky, Lewis, we have Lewis, who's definitely lucky, Janik lucky, Kozak lucky, Nathan lucky, Pretty lucky, Lorna lucky, Edgar also certainly lucky, Melanie lucky. So it seems like a quite lucky room. And no worries, I won't ask the unlucky ones to put too much unlucky. So we might have a certain self-selection status here, but I'm delighted that it looks like we have a quite lucky room, and then sometimes lucky, sometimes unlucky. So we'll come back to that question. Thank you for sharing for now. And so in that journey of kind of after that car accident, I asked myself all these weird questions, and it took me on this intense search for meaning. And I tried to figure out what is life all about. And I started reading this amazing book. I reread it recently when I had COVID and a severe form of it. And it's Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And the book was all about how do we find meaning in crisis? How do we find meaning in the toughest of moments? And when reading that book, what I realized is what I enjoy doing the most is connecting ideas, connecting people, and that spark that comes from doing that. And so it took me on this journey as a community builder, as an entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, and then later on went into academia. And what I found fascinating on this journey is that the most successful purpose-driven people, they seem to have something in common, which is that they somehow intuitively cultivate serendipity. They somehow see a little bit more unexpected moments, and then they connect the dots and turn that into this unexpected good luck. And that's really kind of the journey I'd love to take you on today. How can we cultivate this unexpected smart luck in our lives? That's something I've been focusing on over the last 10 years. And kind of in a way, what we've tried to figure out is if you have all these different stories of serendipity, is there a pattern behind this? Is there a science-based framework for cultivating serendipity? And more importantly, is there some sort of practices that we can all do? Now, even when expecting the unexpected, I do hope that the presentation might work and pop up here. So hopefully you can see it here. But so essentially, someone who summarized it beautifully is Tom Linneberger, the CEO of Cummins, who said that cultivating serendipity is an active approach to leadership in times of uncertainty. Why is that the case? Well, most of us might be in certain transitions, or, trying to figure out how to balance life and work, or somehow kind of, want to be innovative, want to be creative, to Simon's point. And so we somehow have to set ourselves up for being able to create this serendipity, both because it brings this beauty to life, but also because out of necessity, a lot of times we might need this. Now, to make sure we are on the same page, a couple of examples of serendipity. Here's one, the quintessential coffee shop example. If you have erratic hand movements like I do, you spill a lot of coffee. So imagine you spill coffee over someone unexpectedly in a coffee shop, and that person looks at you slightly annoyedly, but you sense there might be something there. You don't know what it is, you just sense there might be something there. And now you have a couple of options, right? One option is you just say, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin, and you walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with that person? Another option, of course, is that you say, I'm so sorry, you start the conversation, and that person turns out to become the love of your life, your co-founder, you name it. The point is that our reaction to the unexpected, making the accident meaningful in a way, then presupposes a lot of what happens next. Here's an example. Any ideas what this might be? Any ideas what this might be? You can put it in the chat. If we can keep the chat open, that's probably a really good idea. Fiona, I just wanted to say it's a really good sign if nobody knows what it is, but now I can't say that anymore. But so essentially, this is a couple of decades ago, researchers gave people medication against angina pectoris, the heart pain, and they realized that male participants didn't want to give the medication back. And so they get curious, and they figured out that it somehow seemed to have improved their sex life exponentially. And so they dove deeper into it, and they realized, oh, wow, we can use this as a medication for erectile dysfunction. And that's indeed how Viagra became one of the world's best-selling medications. Any ideas what this might be here? Chicken fryer? Any ideas? You can use, I think the chat is open. Any ideas what this might be on the upper right? Compost? Chelsea? Perhaps? Compost? Washing machine, Nathan? Ian, air fryer? Kim, air fryer? Yeah, I think we're coming closer. Carlos, washing machine. So toilet flush, Elka? Yeah. Clean chickens, Peter? Yeah, I think that the truth is kind of a mixture of all of what you're saying, which is, so a couple of years ago, a company in China, they produce washing machines, refrigerators, and so on, and they received calls from farmers. And the farmers told them, your crappy washing machine is breaking down. Why is the washing machine breaking down? We're trying to wash our potatoes in it, and it doesn't seem to work. Now, what would we usually do? We probably tell them, well, don't wash your potatoes in the washing machine. It's not part of our plan. This is supposed to be a washing machine for clothes. Now, they did the opposite. They said, you know what? That's unexpected. But there's probably a lot of farmers in the world who have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And that's how the sweet potato washing machine became one of their key products. Now, what all of these examples and hundreds of examples that we mapped have in common is that they all follow the same process. And it's very different from, when you think about how a lot of times we think about the unexpected and luck, we think about something that's rather passive, right? Something that happens to us. But the beautiful thing of serendipity is it's a process that we can influence, where there's some sort of serendipity trigger, right? So there's farmers calling up and saying, your crappy washing machine is breaking down. There's a man not giving back their medication. There is this kind of unexpected coffee spill. So there's this unexpected serendipity trigger. It's random. We never, by definition, know when it happens and where it happens. But then we have to do something with it. We have to imbue meaning in the moment. We have to make that accident meaningful. And as we'll talk about later, we can also create more meaningful accidents. And then a lot of times, of course, we need the tenacity to actually go through with it, right? It's not enough to just realize, oh, we can develop a potato washing machine. So to connect the dots to that need, but we have to have the tenacity to actually turn that into the actual machine. And so a lot of times what might happen is that we might miss either of those steps. And then, of course, within organizations, within companies, we can create the conditions that make it more or less likely that that kind of serendipity happens. Now, the beauty of that process is that we can influence it, right? We can learn how to detect serendipity triggers or to even create them. We can learn how to connect the dots better. And then, of course, we can build the tenacity. To Simon's point, we can build a muscle in general that helps us to develop serendipity. The problem, of course, is that we tend to miss serendipity all the time, either because we don't see it, and I'll talk more about this, or because we might not be able to connect the dots or be willing to connect the dots, right? We might see that farmers use the machine that way, but just not be motivated to say, okay, we'll develop a new product around it. And then, of course, we might just not have the grit, the tenacity to actually go through with it. And so what I want to talk about is really how do we kind of facilitate that process? What can we do about it? So the reason I asked you at the beginning, if you consider yourself to be lucky, is because a lot of times the way we look at the world presupposes a lot of times how, then we go about things and then how much luck we tend to have in the long run. And I want to, show you one experiment or tell you about one experiment that's one of my favorites, but there's a lot of different experiments that show very similar results. And so in this one experiment, they take people who consider themselves to be very lucky, so people who say good things tend to happen to me, and people who consider themselves to be very unlucky, so people who say bad things tend to happen to me, I'm always in accidents and so on. And they pick one of each and they say, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, grab a coffee, sit down, and then we'll have our conversation. What they don't tell them is that there's hidden cameras alongside the street and inside the coffee shop. There's a 10-pound note, so money, right in front of the coffee shop door. And inside the coffee shop, there's only one empty seat next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the money, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, and they have a conversation, and potentially an opportunity comes out of it. We don't know that part. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the 5-pound note, doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, and ignores the businessman. And that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made a new friends, and, potentially a new opportunity coming. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And that's really, you can put people into exactly the same situation. You can, you see that a lot with couples who might go to the same event, and you a lot of times can already tell in advance who will more likely have more serendipity than the other, just because of the way they approach the world. I'll talk about later that, of course, we all have very different starting positions. So that's why I'm highlighting that it's people who are in exactly the same situation versus people who start out from different starting positions. So what are ways to study these kind of things? I mean, this is one example, right? The experiments, and the beautiful thing in this experiment is, of course, that yes, it helps, right, to talk with people, and those opportunities that come with the businessman come because we talk with them. But a lot of times, for closet introverts like myself, serendipity comes from quiet sources. It comes from reading a book. It comes from keeping our eyes open to, potential money literally lying in the street, where then those unexpected, beautiful moments happen. You will see, that your kids probably find more money in the street than you, right? Because they don't expect it to not be there. I find quite a bit of money in the street because I expect it to be there. Mostly pennies, unfortunately, so it doesn't really help my lifestyle, but it's incredible how much money people drop, right, all the time. And so, again, it's kind of because we expect it to not be there, we might not even look for it. But once we open our eyes, we might realize that there's unexpected opportunities everywhere. Other ways to study serendipity, apart from experiments, we do a lot of qualitative research where you look at things by speaking with people, observing people. We spend a lot of times, for example, in incubators, where we look at when an entrepreneur unexpectedly meets some other entrepreneur, what do they do with that? Where does it lead? And so really kind of looking at it over time. And then, of course, it's also really fun to study counterfactuals. So what could have happened, right? So if you think about the coffee shop examples, what could have been other ways that could have happened had you reacted differently? And then kind of that's the thought experiment that also can help us think through those kind of things. But so one brief thing that I wanted to mention here is that, of course, there's a lot of objective constraints, right? So a lot of inequality, a lot of my work is at the base of the pyramid. So the poorest of the poor, especially in parts of Kenya, in parts of South Africa. And that's, of course, very different base levels of opportunity, right? And of potential serendipity. So while we're talking about mindset, of course, we want to think about how do we create the opportunity space for people. And I think, when you look at Alberta Innovate and others, like, I think they're really smart about thinking, how do you create an opportunity space for people where that could also happen, that you actually increase the base level for potential serendipity for people who might be less privileged from the beginning. But then, of course, and that's really what we're talking about today, there's also a lot of subjective things that might just hold us back from something. So, for example, one question for if you want to put your answer in the chat, what do you think is the probability that two people in this room of, let's say, I don't know how many we are now, let's say 150, what do you think is the probability in this room of 150 people that two people have the same birthday, so that you celebrate on the same day? Is it, 40%, 30%, 20%, 5%? What do you think is the probability? 5%, 10, 50%, 70, 90, 10, 25, 50. Yeah, 0 for mine. That's interesting. Wait, so you says 0 for mine. That's really interesting. I want, like, that's the whole conversation itself potentially, but great. So this is usually something, if we would be in the same room together, we would now play a fun game around this, but I will keep this short. But essentially, the probability in this room is 99.9999999%. So it's essentially impossible that we don't have one birthday pair. We'll probably have like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 birthday pairs. Usually in a room of 23 people, you already have 2 people who have the same birthday. That's mind blowing, right? 23 people, 2, 3. You have a 50% probability that 2 people have the same birthday. When you have 60, 70, 80 people, it gets up to the kind of 99%. Now, this is kind of mind blowing, especially when you do it in a room, right? If you kind of see people raising their hands and like talking about when they have their birthdays. Rosa, I mean, we could test it in terms of if everyone wants to briefly put their birthday, and if you see someone else with your birthday. So we need everyone's collaboration for this to just, if you spot your birthday. So if everyone puts their birthday, and then if you spot your birthday, then please let us know. So if you see any overlaps, please let us know. We have 2 September 30th, I think, right? No, not yet. But yeah, so if you see any overlaps, please let us know the names of the 2 overlaps. So we have 2 February 4th. Thank you, Wally, for spotting that. Jeff saw an overlap. Jeff, let us know which overlap. April 25th also is an overlap. So that's the second pair. 2 January 28th. Thank you, Sarah, for spotting. Third one, 2 June 3rd. Thank you, Jan, for spotting. September 17th, 2 Laurel and Shannon. Thank you for spotting. And again, if we would go through it now with everyone and everyone seeing it, I guarantee you would find 5 to 15 pairs probably. September 30th. Thank you, Ali, Kim, and Nathan. So we even have a triple pair here. So we see there's a lot of overlaps. So again, the point here is that it's extremely likely in this room that we had 1, but it's also very likely actually that we have a lot of pairs. And the reason for this is that this is very similar to how we approach life, right? In life, we think relatively linear, right? So we would think, okay, there's 150 people, 365 days in the year. You divide them by each other and you come up with something 50-ish% or 40% or something. So relatively low probability, especially in rooms with less people. But this function, like life, is exponential, right? So where if Kim has 149 people in this room who could have their birthday, Julian still has 148 people, Simon still has 147 people. And so there's all these potential connections. And the whole idea is that it's to the power of. So long story short, this is the birthday paradox. Those of you who want to check it out. But so the really interesting thing is here that because we expect, like in life, that we can plan things out, we think very linearly, right? We think we have the variables, we can plan it out, but there's so many potential unexpected things because there's so many potential things that so many potential variables that have connections to each other, that in a way, the unexpected is extremely likely, both the negatively unexpected and the positively unexpected. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that the positively unexpected is everywhere, whether we see it or not. But once we start to look for it, we start to see it more often, right? Once you look for potential money in the street, you start to see it. Once you believe that every conversation could be in some way interesting, you start to have more interesting conversations and so on. And I'll get back to that in a second. But that's one of our major biases that I wanted to mention, that we tend to underestimate the likelihood of the positively unexpected. And by doing this, we underestimate that, there's so much exponentiality that we could potentially use in our lives. Another bias, of course, is functional fixedness. It's the hammer nail problem, right? Once we have a hammer, once we have a hammer and we need a nail in the wall, we will always look for hammers, versus we could probably use other heavy objects. So once we have one particular problem solution, one particular solution for something, we tend to look for, okay, let's solve this, versus stepping back and saying, what's actually the bigger picture? But the one, before I get into the concrete practices, that I really wanted to share is around our kind of fears. What I'd love to do is, if you want to put in the chat, those of you who feel like sharing, who of you would consider yourself to either have imposter syndrome or fear of rejection? Just put like number one or something. So I put myself here, as kind of like having some sort of imposter plus fear of rejection, all of the above. So we have some imposter, quite a few, right? So if we would go through this, usually in a room of 150 people, and I ask people, who of you has imposter syndrome or fear of rejection, more than half of the room puts their arms up. And that's the ones who are self-aware enough, right? And then you have like all the others who might not be self-aware enough, but who actually probably might also have some of it in some resemblance. And so the point is that at the end of the day, we all have some sort of underlying, fears or biases that potentially can hold us back. And so the one that I want to focus on briefly is the fear of rejection. Kind of imagine you're in a meeting and you have this unexpected, brilliant idea, and you don't bring it up because you don't feel ready, you don't feel worthy, you don't feel whatever it is, and you're afraid of kind of the feedback, and so you don't bring it up. And then you walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I brought up that idea, right? Similar to that coffee shop moment, I wished I had spoken to that person. Or imagine you're at a conference, you bump into that amazing speaker person, and you're like, I should have talked with them, but I didn't dare to speak with them. The point is that I used to then think that in those kind of situations, the worst thing that can happen is the sting of rejection, right? This kind of feeling of, okay, I'd rather not do it because there might be rejection. And then I realized that's not the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that can happen is that regret that comes from not doing it, right? Walking out of this room and thinking, what could have happened? And then going back to that thought over and over again. And so I think that reframing, what we've seen a lot in our work is that once you reframe situations away from what's the worst thing that can happen if I do it, right? This thing of rejection, to what's the worst thing that can happen if I don't do it, which is essentially the fear of regrets, the loss of all this opportunity that could have been, all these different things, then actually it becomes much more risky to not act on it. And I think, at least in my case, it has helped me a lot to kind of think about situations differently and to reframe it. But the long story short is there's a lot of kind of practice I'll talk about now, but I'm also a big fan of really everyone stepping back and thinking about, in my own life, whenever serendipity could have happened, but it didn't, what was it behind it that held me back? And then really reflecting on this, right? Is it imposter syndrome? Is it fear of rejection? And then really working on this, because all the practices we talk about, in a way, also are benefiting from that kind of self-awareness. Now, this is the last bias I wanted to mention before I get to the practices, which is, this whole idea of post-rationalization, that we plan things out and then real life happens, but we then tell it step by step again. I work a lot with people who, in boardrooms, for example, where if you're the CEO, you want to go into the boardroom and you want to say, I planned this, then this happened, and then exactly, my plan came to fruition. But actually, to exactly James' point, man plans and God laughs. This is exactly right. Like a lot of times it's kind of more like this. And so what I found fascinating with this work is to say, instead of having a passive vocabulary that's about, oh, and then I was surprised that this happened and we didn't have control, right? Which kind of is in a way, a very passive way to think about it. It's really more about saying, no, like we had a certain idea of where we're going. then we were open to the unexpected. We made it part of the plan, and so we cultivated serendipity in that. And that's really something, one of the key themes that came out of our research. We did a study recently, for example, with over 30 of the world's leading CEOs. We sat down with them and we said, what is it that truly makes you successful? And one of the core themes is that they're extremely good at saying, I'm setting a certain sense of direction. So if I'm Ajay Banga at MasterCard, I'm saying, I want to bring 500 million people who were previously unbanked into the financial system so that they can access, finance and everything else and become entrepreneurs. Here's the strategy, but I'm telling you already now that we will adjust the strategy based on new information coming in. And that's not losing control. That's part of the plan. And so once you do that, you essentially legitimize the idea, like with a potato washing machine, that while you're knowing where you're going, you're also essentially legitimizing that you don't know exactly always how exactly you will get there. So what are other kind of ways of how we can cultivate serendipity? One of my absolute favorites is the hook strategy. The hook strategy is all about saying, how can I use every conversation to cast a couple of hooks where other people can connect the dots for me? So someone who does that really well is Ollie Barrett, who's an entrepreneur in London. And if we would ask Ollie this dreaded, what do you do question, right, at the conference, he wouldn't just say, I'm an entrepreneur or I'm an ecosystem builder or something like this. He would say something like, I'm an education entrepreneur, recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. We are hosting piano sessions. You should stop by. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching on the philosophy of science. You should give a guest lecture. The point is we can all think about 2 or 3 hooks that in our lives are relevant, right? I just became a father, so I'm very excited to bring that into introductions because I'm learning a lot about fatherhood at the moment. So I want people to go, oh my God, such a coincidence. We also have a 1-year-old at the moment. So, let's exchange ideas. And so the point is, that's something we can, in our serendipity diary, we can write that down in terms of what are 2 or 3 hooks I can use in different conversations when I introduce myself, but also in general, to kind of cast those hooks and bring them into conversation. And from the most unexpected of places come the most unexpected of ideas. Another one is really kind of the idea of how do we ask questions? Do we ask the dreaded, what do you do question at conferences or so? Or do we ask questions like, what inspired you about this presentation? Or, what brought you here? Anything that kind of is a little bit more about understanding the person versus kind of putting them into a box allows us for this opportunity space, that potentiality that serendipity is all about. For the sake of time, I'm going to wrap up with 2 more. Ruthie, thank you for sharing. So Ruthie says, oh, wow, what a coincidence. I actually have a busy dad tips website that I'm currently working on. Thank you so much, Ruthie. Can you put the link, please? Then I'll definitely check it out. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of other parents in this session who might want to check it out. Thank you, Greg, also for the congrats. So I want to kind of wrap up the practices so that we have a little bit more time also for Q&A. I think Melanie made a great point, pondering that serendipity requires authenticity and vulnerability. That's a really great point, right? That in a way, the way of how we cast hooks, for example, the way of how we present ourselves to others, the more we can do that in ways that feels true to ourselves, the more also then people can connect the dots to something that feels truly meaningful to us, right? So that kind of is almost like a virtuous cycle that we can create. And vulnerability is an interesting one, right? There's amazing work, right, by Brené Brown, who wrote about this idea that if we kind of, it's absolutely not about oversharing and all these kind of things that are all about, just putting stuff on people. It's about the opposite. It's about saying, how do we essentially share with people in a way, what are some things that we might be vulnerable about, like what we did earlier, right? That most of us feel like imposters. Now we can talk about how do we overcome imposter syndrome, but we can't talk about it if we hadn't shared that most of us might have that. And so it's really kind of this idea of let's kind of have some sort of vulnerability when the situation allows, because that's actually allowing for meaningful connection to degrees that other things might not allow. So to wrap up the practices, there's a lot of other things. I'm a big fan. I think there's always a huge pressure on find your passion, find your purpose. I'm a much bigger fan of thinking about what's my curiosity, find your curiosity, so that you have some kind of space where you can cast hooks, where you can explore, and then you find the things that feel most meaningful to one and go from there. I'll just So to wrap this part up, again, we can talk about the other practices later if you feel like it, but I want to bring that point home, that a lot of times I get asked, well, what is it like? Is this kind of more for like the privileged ones, right? So is this something a nice to have for people that brings you a little bit more serendipity? Not at all. This is actually something, a lot of times it's actually about necessity-based serendipity. It's about that out of necessity, people create serendipity. This is an example here from one of the organizations that I worked a lot with in the Cape Flats in Cape Town, Reconstructed Living Labs. They have this beautiful tagline, "Make Hope Contagious." And they have an approach. It's essentially a low-cost education approach. It's something like 10 steps to use social media to build your business. And they operate out of the Cape Flats in Cape Town, part of the Cape Flats where there's high crime rates, high unemployment, and there's nothing really there that traditionally we would see as a resource. But what they said is, look, once we reframe the situation and don't only look at people and things like liabilities, but we look at everyone as a potential source of potentiality, then magic can happen. So they look at a former drug dealer and they say, fantastic. That person will have a lot of social capital. They know everyone. That person will be very creative, and they channeled their way in questionable ways. But if we make them a teacher, now it becomes cool to be a teacher. And that's how we turn a local community around. They look at an old garage, they see a potential training center. And so it's really this idea of, instead of focusing on resources and what we need, to what is already here and how do we make the best of it, they have serendipity happen en masse. And so I was actually, a lot of my kind of, what I learned about serendipity, I learned from them, how out of necessity they create a lot of that smart luck. Because for them, it's the major way to keep hope in an environment where it seems very hopeless. And so again, this is not in contrast to that. Of course, we also have to enable people to have, less rough contexts, but at the same time, it's also really saying we can learn a lot about how, especially in those contexts, people have a lot of times a mindset that allows them to make the best out of a certain situation. And then as a company, a lot of banks, for example, have learned from this, or a lot of other kind of organizations, where instead of saying, oh, we have to just cut costs and let people go because we don't need the cashier anymore, maybe the person, the teller person, right, the cashier, because we have a machine now, but we don't have to necessarily let them go because they could be a financial trainer, and maybe the old office could be a financial training center. And so it's really about this idea of how do we make the best out of what is here, versus only thinking about what is the kind of resources we need. And that really kind of is a big shift. Now, to wrap this up, I grew up in Heidelberg, where Goethe and Schiller wrote a lot of their poems. And I've been a big fan of this idea of Goethe, that if you take someone as they are, you make them worse. But if you take them as what they could be, you make them capable of becoming what they can be. And that's really what serendipity is all about. Serendipity is about potentiality. It's about what could be. And then seeing a little bit more in people and in situations, and that allows us then to connect the dots differently and create that kind of creativity and smart luck that really kind of makes the world go around. With this, my editor mentions, I should mention that this is the book that kind of brings a lot of this together. And with this, I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. And I don't know, Simon, shall I just take the questions that I see, or shall I, is someone moderating it? What is the best way?
Yeah, I'll happily moderate, Christian. Thanks a lot for that insightful presentation. And for those of you that are not aware, there's a Q&A option within the Zoom function. So do ask the Q&A, and we'll make sure that Christian gets those questions. So I've got some questions for you, Christian, that have come through both on the chat and Q&A. One of the ones to begin with is about serendipity triggers. So obviously this is the front end of the process that you've just explained. And wondering whether you could say, if there was one or two things that the audience could do today, leaving this space, to trigger serendipity more, beyond spilling coffee over people, because maybe we shouldn't be encouraging that and burns and all that. But what would you say would be those one or two things that are really practical, but really easy just to get more serendipity in our lives?
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of really, like, as a first step, thinking about what am I really curious about at the moment? So is there something at the moment that I want to learn more about that feels particularly meaningful to me? So again, right, in my life at the moment, it's I want to learn more about parenting. So I want to check out Ruth's blog. I want to learn more about, how I can take the ideas of the book into more organizations, like those kind of things. So I'm thinking about what am I curious about? What are things I want to do? And then how can I build that as hooks into every conversation, every introduction, everything I'm doing? So when I catch up with an old colleague, I would be like, hey, it's so great to see you again. Like, I'm so tired at the moment because we have this baby now. So I'm really learning about it, but now I'm here and I'm so excited. And so what I'm doing here is I'm building in that hook into whatever conversation comes my way. And for the person, it just seems like a random kind of, it's just a side note, but they can pick whichever one they are most excited about. And so I'm a big fan of really, to me, like amongst all the kind of literally hundreds of strategies that that we've been focusing on, the hook strategy is the one that you can literally right now, the next conversation you have, that's the first thing you can do. In teams, what I found extremely useful is to focus a little bit more on how do we integrate that mindset into the day-to-day. For example, why not ask in the weekly meeting, what surprised you last week? Was there anything that questioned your assumption? And then someone might say, oh, well, it really surprised me that people use our product completely differently. It really surprised me that people were using that to wash potatoes. And so there is kind of where your next innovation comes from. And so I think it's those kind of ways getting into that mindset of asking people for things that surprise them, thinking about what is surprising us, thinking about why is that surprising. And then kind of, I think by doing this, what happens is you start to look out for the unexpected. You start to incentivize people to look out for it. And then also, I think there's a lot of value in really thinking about, because sometimes people ask, do you have to be an optimist for this, right? Because not all of us are deep optimists, right? And so I, with permission of my wife, am allowed to share. I learned that I should always, I always ask for permission first when it comes to marital questions. But so I had that conversation with her about how she has tons of serendipity in her life. She's probably the person who has the most experience with serendipity around me. But she's not always the most optimistic person. She's not always the kind of, most upbeat person, but she's extremely good at connecting dots, at connecting things. So when she speaks with you, she would always think about, can I make one introduction? Does that link to anything I thought about last week? And then really providing that value to the other person. By doing this, you're literally wiring your brain, right? That's the whole idea of neuroplasticity, that you can rewire your brain to see those different bridges where others just see holes, where others just see gaps. And I think that's the most exciting thing, I think, what we can do with our own brain, that we wire it to see those bridges.
That's a fantastic lead into the next question, Christian, which is around connecting the dots. So obviously that was the second part in your process. And you've just spoken about, providing introduction as an example. We know those people when we meet them, but, they have a big network. Size of network is a big part and holds a relationship with innovation, creativity, coming up with new and big ideas. What are some, aside to making connections with and between people, what are some of the really simple steps you'd say that we can help to associate different things together and be more creative?
Well, I mean, I think Rudy did a fantastic thing. And I think I see some like Logan now and Anke. I think that's exactly it. Like, you literally, like, the first immediate thing now is like to literally put in the chat, like, hey, I'm currently excited about this, or hey, like, if anyone's looking for this, whatever it is, like just something that feels at this point like came to mind that is some kind of hook or some kind of idea. And it's fascinating, right? Look, like I will check out the blog about the parenting thing. My wife has a baby company, which might then feature that blog, right? Because they have a lot of followers. Like it's kind of this thing where then like luck starts to happen because it's on the radar. And I think that's kind of the beautiful thing, right? That these kind of like things, social media, Zoomish type settings and so on provide us, that it's so easy to just plant a quick flag. And then a lot of times nothing happens, but you don't need 200 people to react to something, right? You just need one person to like think, oh, this is really interesting. Let me quickly check this up, and then we'll figure it out. So my point is, I'm actually a huge fan. Sometimes I talk with people who talk about that question, right? What do you do if you don't have social capital yet? So if you're kind of starting out and you don't have connections yet, and a lot of times serendipity comes from, to your point, the interplay between different people. And so I'm a huge fan of thinking about what are public platforms where I can leverage the social capital of someone else. So in this room, for example, now we're speaking, right? Theoretically, that's your social capital that's in the room. But everyone in this room now, with like literally putting a comment in the chat, has an audience of 200 people for something. So as long as that's somehow relevant and not kind of like promotional, kind of, hey, like buy my product here, right? Which kind of, I think is obviously a big turnoff. But if it's kind of like more around, like there's some interesting hook there, that's kind of something that I'm a big fan of. So to give you an example, I've been working with kids who come out of prison who would be like, oh, as you can imagine, that's the toughest CV you can have, right? Explain why you were for 3 years. Like, what's the gap in the CV for 3 years here? Like, what did you do? But also then there's not a lot of social capital. And so the idea there would be, okay, think about who around you are the institutional multipliers. So the local university, the local XYZ association that is hosting public events, whatever it is. And then you go to those public events, either online or now again in person. And then, you listen to the talk. And then when they say, who has the first question, you ask the first question. You stand up energetically so that they can't ignore you, not too much, but like in a way that they can't ignore you. And the way you phrase the question is to say, thank you so very much for this inspiring speech. So making it all about the speaker. As someone who is currently exploring to go into XYZ sector and who had a rough patch, I was wondering, like, what would you suggest XYZ? What's fascinating is that after the talk, there's always 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people out of the audience who come to the person and say, my God, such a coincidence. My sister just had a rough patch. She's just setting up a new thing. You should connect with her. My God, such a coincidence. We're mentoring people who just had a rough patch, whatever it is. And so my key point here is I think there's a lot of hidden social capital that we might not be aware of. That is not our own social capital, but you can tap into that social capital. And I think that's kind of the fascinating thing that I think once we become aware of the latent social capital, the kind of hidden dormant social capital that is all around us, the local rabbi, the local priest, the local imam, like those are people who are super connectors. Like you tell them something, they're like, oh my God, yes, like this, I'll talk about it during my mess next week. And so it's kind of those things where it's really kind of like starting to see that, like to make visible the potentiality that's out there.
Yeah, I really, really love what you're saying. I mean, so much of this is about actually articulating what are our current problems, what are our current challenges, sharing openly and honestly with people and inviting them into that challenge or that problem and being a co-conspirator in many regards in terms of helping you to shape a future, a way forward. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing that, Christian. Another very practical question came through is, what's your favorite question to get people to open up when first starting a conversation? So once you've spilt coffee on them, what is that first question that you would ask to start that conversation, a really easy conversation starter?
Yeah. Well, and as mentioned, right, I don't recommend spilling coffee on people. As mentioned, right, I think there's making accidents meaningful. So whenever an accident happened, like how do you imbue meaning? And then there's creating meaningful accidents. I think creating the meaningful accidents, there's other tools than the spilling the coffee. But like the hook strategy and other things. But one of my absolute favorites is really kind of more the contextual, to think about, okay, what is the core theme here? So if there's let's say, I don't know, imagine you're going to a conference and like there's a speech, and then like afterwards there's kind of like just people walking around, then like it would be a question like, what inspired you about that speech, or what did you find most interesting, or something that kind of like in a way is not about, oh, like the food here was bad, or this, like something that's just kind of like about gossiping or something, but something that's really more about trying to understand the motivation of the other or what makes them interested. And so it's really kind of questions like this, like what inspired you about this, what keeps you busy at the moment, like what is it kind of, things that open up the spectrum of understanding what the person is all about. And then once you go deeper, right, like, I mean, it's almost kind of like when you take the metaphor of a date, right? Once you're on the 4th date, like then you ask more about things like, I don't know, what are you reading at the moment, or what kind of like things that in a way make you understand the person a little bit more. But I think the starting point always, I feel like contextual reference is always easy. And I'm a big fan actually of writing down 3 or 4 questions you can ask at every event. So again, almost every event has some sort of presentation or something. So you can always ask a question like, what inspired you about XYZ thing? Or a question like, what brings you here? Like, what do you hope out of this, to get out of this, whatever it is, but just something, again, that's more about their motivation and not kind of what do you do and then puts them into that box.
Fantastic. No, thank you for that, Christian. Next question. So is luck context specific? So this question focuses on, can you fluctuate from feeling lucky to feeling unlucky depending on what your experience is? So whether it's in your job, whether it's in love, a personal relationship, whatever that might be. So do you get that sense that luck isn't just a common construct that goes across everything? It's actually something that changes based upon context.
Yeah. I love that question, because actually just this morning, the nerdy academic in me was actually working on a paper where what we're doing there a lot is trying to understand that, how serendipity is so socially constructed, right? It's in a way yes, there's some sort of like intersubjective kind of understanding of there's an unexpected event, right? So it might be COVID, it might be the train kind of like, or the car breaking down, things like this, right? So you would say from a kind of bird's eye perspective, okay, this is an unexpected event, but then the surprise itself is in the eye of the beholder, right? So it's kind of like the Nassim Taleb idea of like, Thanksgiving is surprising to the turkey, but not to the butcher, right? And so it's really kind of that idea that in a way, serendipity is subjective for most part. It's something that depends on how we interpret the situation. And more importantly, though, and I think that comes to the really interesting point, is that a lot of times unlucky events become inflection points for serendipity, right? So in my case, for example, one of my companies almost going bankrupt, then became the best thing, and kind of like because it forced us to rethink our approach, it forced us to rethink who our customers are and so on, and then that kind of became like a really lucky outcome in how we could build something. And so now we consider that as kind of like a serendipitous thing. But back in the moment, if you would have asked us, we would have said, oh my God, this is the worst time of our life. It feels existential. It feels like the world is going down. Same with the relationship, right? Like the breakup in the moment feels like, oh my God, it's the end of the world. Like this was the one person that I always wanted to be with. And then 2 years later, you meet the real person you will spend the rest of your life with. And you're like, thank you so much that the person broke up with me. Otherwise, I couldn't have met that person, right? And so it's almost like you needed that inflection point to be getting to where you are now. And I think when you talk with people about their careers, what happens a lot of times, right, is that you will hear that story of, oh, Lehman Brothers went bankrupt and then I was fired, but that set me on a track to understand what's really meaningful to me. And I built my business and now I'm so excited about it. So it's kind of these things where, that's why I'm such a big fan of Viktor Frankl, because it's so much about this idea of if I can find meaning in whatever situation, then the situation doesn't define me, but I can define the situation. I think that's kind of the reframing away from if I'm the person who's broken up with, and now I identify with this for the rest of my life, I'll always be the one broken up with, and I'll probably not find a new person because I'm always just talking about that person I was, in love with and they broke up with me. Versus if I'm saying, okay, like, let's move forward, then I redefine that situation at some point to my inflection point of now, I can be with you because fortunately this person broke up with me. And so I'm very kind of excited about this. And at the same time, again, I think there are objective things. We can never blame anyone for bad luck. We can never, we all have bad luck. We all have people dying, so it's those kind of idea where it's socially constructed partly, but also I think objectively, you can never blame anyone for objective bad luck that happens in their life.
Yeah, fascinating. And one of the areas you're talking about, and that I've seen typically with organizations, is often change can only happen if there's a significant shock to that organization. And so crisis and crisis-driven change is a big way that individuals and organizations affect change. And so much of this then comes through to, well, how do you affect change? Well, you have to create your own crisis yourself, potentially. And how do you create that platform for change, both as an individual, but also in an organization? So fascinating to be thinking about that. There's a couple of academics in the audience, clearly, because they're going to ask you a couple of academic questions, but then we're going to finish off with 2 practical questions as well. But they're asking about the relationship between serendipity, and one of them is talking about the high levels of openness to experience, which is part of this Big 5 personality trait. So have you sort of studied this aligned with the Big 5? And the other question is around curiosity and the link between curiosity and serendipity. So wondering whether you've experienced either of those things.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the way I'm looking at it is very much like a Venn diagram type approach, where it's kind of saying, yes, if you are curious, it's more likely that you will, question your assumptions. It's more likely that you will, see the money in the street because you believe it might be there, right? So it's those kind of things where I'm actually a big fan. I don't have it here, but of the Little Prince book, which is all about essentially asking why all the time, right? Because once you ask why all the time, you have that open-mindedness and the curiosity. What happens is that you tend to encounter serendipity more by definition. So the long story short is really that yes, kind of like, in our academic work, and delighted to those of you interested, please do send me an email. I'm delighted to send you some of those papers where we bring together those different literatures, everything from, creativity-linked literature, curiosity, open-mindedness, growth mindset type literatures, and say, okay, how does that all fit together to then develop this potentiality that serendipity is about? And that potentiality, yes, it gets bigger if you're curious, but also if you're not as curious, but you're extremely good at connecting dots, you might still have a lot of serendipity. And so really this idea of that yes, there's all these beautiful overlaps, and nobody has to be perfect in a way, because there's a lot of ways to roam in that regard. And by the way, Simon, just as a side note, right, you probably will be too humble to mention this, but someone here mentioned that you really changed their life. I just wanted to highlight this. Jackie mentioned that. Thank you for Dr. Simon Raby for being one of those people who changed my mindset significantly, coming from a perfectionist and worried about failure, but had some great mentors who helped me to find tenacity. And, you know, this actually to me hits home very close in terms of really thinking about who are the kind of people I want to surround myself with. Because if you think about everything we just talked about, so much is reliant on who are the people around us who allow us to think big versus not, who allow us to be who we want to be versus not. And so I think being really conscious about who do I want to surround myself with, and if there are people that in a way, quote unquote, have to be around, right? Sometimes we are in toxic environments where there's maybe not that many ways to cut ties, which obviously is always the kind of last resort. Then really thinking about, okay, how do I somehow design my life in ways that doesn't drain me in that regard? And I always highly recommend that is one of the absolute key things, and really being proactive about thinking about who are one or two or three people who maybe have serendipity in their life a lot, with whom I could hang out more, or mentors where I feel they've intuitively done a lot. Can I just shadow them for a bit? Can I just hang out with them just to see what they do, just to get a feel for how they do it? And that's also for leaders, by the way. I'm a big fan when you think about putting together teams, that you really think about how do you put together the person who seems really, really unlucky with the person who seems really lucky, just for the unlucky person to see there are things I can do, because I think there's only so much you can tell a person, right? There's only so much I can tell someone who says, I don't believe I can be luckier. But once they experience it, like that's where the biggest shift happened. I mean, maybe as a last point on this, I remember I had a colleague in London, very eminent professor, and he would be like, Christian, I love you, I love your work, but I don't need more serendipity in my life. Like I have like a good life, good family. Why do I need it? And so we made a deal, and we said, you know what? Just cast a couple of hooks, ask a couple of different questions, and then let's talk about it in a month. He comes back and he's like, Christian, I didn't know life can be so joyful. And so the point here is that it's those small behavioral shifts, right? Where people start with small things, and then they start seeing it, and then they start believing that it's possible. And then kind of it's the real step change comes with those who didn't believe it, but who then kind of in a way have the biggest radical change.
Yeah, no, such important points, Christian. Thank you for sharing those with us. And just to close out, before I close the session, recommendations on resources. So you've mentioned obviously about the academic area and the papers that could be shared, but if someone wanted to go to a space on serendipity, and clearly they can purchase your book, and I'll be announcing a competition at the end with the feedback survey where people can get a copy of the book. But what would be the resource or the voice that you would say people should go to and approach to learn more about serendipity after this conversation?
Yeah. Well, so there's something called the Serendipity Society, where they bring together academics who are interested in that space, but also, you know, people who are just generally interested in the general things. Those of you who ask the questions around curiosity and different traits and everything, you will find that there's a lot of people who are covering those questions. So I think it's a beautiful kind of pool of different academics and non-academics who are working on this. I'm a big fan of really also of kind of psychology literature. So I'm a big fan of everything around growth mindset, for example, the Carol Dweck things, but also then Brené Brown, vulnerability. I think the more we get into this idea that, yes, I can change, yes, I can allow myself to be a little bit more who I want to be. And then maybe a little bit also around kind of like thinking, as we talked about, right? Who do I need around me to surround myself with? So really kind of thinking about who are the communities in, you know, wherever you are, who kind of in a way maybe are the aspirational ones with whom you would like to spend more time, and just kind of going to a couple of, you know, co-working space meetings where you think you had nothing in common with them, but maybe it's just the exposure to kind of that entrepreneurial thinking if you're currently stuck in a job where you don't feel entrepreneurial and stuff like that. So I think it's really kind of putting ourselves into those different types of communities, and that we have a curiosity for at the moment, and just kind of going without expectations. I mean, I'm a big fan, right, of this idea that happiness is expectations minus reality. And so really kind of not coming with big expectations, but really just with a curiosity. And then a lot of times that kind of spirals into, oh my God, hey, yes, my sister is looking into something similar. Let me put you in touch. And then kind of it's these beautiful links that so the long story short is, I don't think there's one perfect community or one perfect best way, but I think it's just getting going and putting ourselves into those settings and then becoming more selective with, okay, which kind of communities do I spend more versus less time with? Because you will then very quickly get a sense for where you get more versus less.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for this uplifting mood changer conversation, Christian. I know a lot of people are showing you love on the chat and just how much this is really striking a balance with where they are in their lives and also where they want to go with innovation. And for those of you that do want to get a copy of Christian's book, we're going to be giving away 10 free copies. There's going to be a link posted into the chat function by one of the Growth Catalyst team. So if you provide your feedback through that link, the first 10 people that provide their feedback will get a copy of the book. So please do click that link now and do that. But thanks again to Christian and to the Growth Catalyst team for arranging this session. For our next session, just to announce, we're going to be coming back on January 5th with Vern Harnish, the Scale Up guy, and Christine Burr. So for those of you that don't know Christine, she's a Calgary-based entrepreneur who has started, scaled, and exited her previous venture. And she's going to share the good, bad, and ugly of her scaling up story. So please stay in touch with the Growth Catalyst. Join our events, our newsletters at growthcatalyst.ca. That's growthcatalyst.ca. Sign up for your newsletter. And other than just to say thank you so much to our funders, Alberta Innovates, Prairie Can, TD Ready Commitment, and the Kathy Bruce Williams Fund. And thanks again to Christian for sharing such a thought-provoking session with us today. So have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, Roger, everyone. Looking forward to keeping in touch. And thanks so much, Simon. I appreciate the wonderful conversation. And thanks, everyone. Goodbye.